Okay, so can people see my full screen? I've been having some Zoom issues.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. Apologies for my appearance. My desk is right in front of a window and I can't find any way to not make it look like I'm a light bulb. So sorry about that. But thank you so much for coming. Yeah, today I'm going to talk a bit about what we can learn from Robert Aickman about writing the ghostly, and specifically this idea of the artifice story. So we're going to begin by looking at some theories of what this type of story involves. And then we're going to be looking at one Aickman story in particular, The Hospice, which has been sent around to everyone, but you don't need to have read it before this session. I was going to say this might spoil it, but I actually don't think it's possible to spoil an Aickman story for reasons that we'll get into. But we're going to be looking in particular about the techniques that Aickman uses to create this ghostly effect in a story that arguably doesn't actually have any ghosts in it, which is the case with many of his stories. So the title of this talk, Laughed Out of Life and Replaced by Nothing, comes from his story Never Visit Venice. And I thought that really encapsulated what Aickman was often writing about, this idea that something mystical in Britain had been kind of removed from modern life and that left a kind of hollow shell behind. And that's the kind of locus of the ghostliness of his stories. So a little bit about Aickman. This is him. So he was born in 1914, died in 1981. So he was an interesting figure. He was quite contradictory in many ways. So he founded the Canal and Rivers Trust and was heavily involved for many years, lived on a canal boat for many years, but he believed that we took a wrong turn at the Industrial Revolution. So he had these contradictory belief systems. On the one hand, he hated the Industrial Revolution and everything that it stood for and had led to. On the other hand, he was deeply enamored of this very industrial infrastructure. And I think this kind of almost hypocrisy in his character comes through in a lot of his stories. So his stories were what he called strange stories, and we'll talk a bit as we go on about what that actually means. So these are his books that were kind of published originally. So his first collection was We Are for the Dark, 6 Ghost Stories, which he co-authored with Elizabeth Jane Howard, who he had a very close relationship with, was in love with throughout his whole life, according to those who knew him. Though he had some very difficult romantic entanglements throughout his life. Again, that shows through in a lot of his stories, I think. Then in 1964, we had Dark Entries, Curious and Macabre Ghost Stories. In 1966, Powers of Darkness, Macabre Stories. In 1968, Sub Rosa's Strange Tales. In 1975, Cold Hand in Mine, 8 Strange Stories. And that is where the story we're going to be discussing today comes from. We had Tales of Love and Death in 1977, Intrusion, Strange Tales in 1980, and then a couple of posthumously published books. So Night Voices, Strange Stories in 1987, and Strangers and Other Writings in 2015. He also wrote novels, but we're going to be looking at his short fiction today. So you can see some words coming up across these stories, macabre and strange mostly. So we're going to be talking a bit about how strangeness in particular factors into his stories. But firstly, what we mean by artifice stories. So the publisher, Comma Press, divide short stories into 3 types, epical, lyrical, and artifice. And so this is their definition of artifice stories. They write that the artifice story doesn't derive its power from a surprise revelation or from the slow development of a central image. So they're referring there to the epical story, which derives its power from this kind of surprising ending, and then the lyrical story, which relies on this central image. But from the unlikely insertion of a seemingly incompatible ingredient right at the start. The surprise comes from the fact that this ingredient is out of place. It belongs to a different reality than the rest of the story. Like an asteroid from a different genre or dimension, it sits at the start of the story, smouldering ominously. The otherwise conventional, realist narrative it crash lands into then tries to assimilate it and incorporate it, and its failure to do so is what ultimately gives the story its meaning. So I think we can apply this formula to almost any Aickman story. They're all set in a relatively recognizable world, the late 20th century, in which characters interact with very real kind of features of everyday life. So the characters often have kind of middle class jobs. So they might be civil servants, might be clerks. They often have these kind of very mundane, everyday environments, but into that something very strange is brought. And that strange thing might be actual strange events like we're going to be looking at in this story. It might be strange emotions. So often there's very strong affect in these stories. People feel very strongly, but struggle to deal with those feelings in this very repressed culture. And so ultimately, what these stories are often about is the kind of lack of passion and mystery and strangeness that is permitted in everyday life in Britain, but the fact that those undercurrents still remain and what happens when they burst through the surface. And that kind of disjuncture between what is felt and then what is seen creates this kind of ghostliness. So, the texts that I'm going to refer to here are mostly from this collection, The New Short Story Theories, which I really recommend. There's lots of articles in there about the art of the short story. So I've just picked out some quotes that I think really speak to this idea of artifice. So in The Nature of Knowledge in Science Fiction, Charles E. May argues that primitive man's feelings of solidarity came to him in the midst of episodic encounters with the sacred, set apart from the profane reality of the everyday flow of life by his individual emotional response to the experiences. These episodes in which the inner meaning of things was manifested, in which nature and the self were united in what for him was true reality, he attempted to stabilize for himself and communicate to others in stories that were short. So he essentially argues here that the original function of the short story was to convey this sense of encounters with the sacred. So we might see this in fables, in the tradition of kind of stories at the fireside, and ghost stories certainly fall into that. A few things I want to pick out here. Firstly, this idea of emotional response as being central to these experiences. So, the factor that makes these experiences
Mhm.
sacred is this affect. So, the fact that they are creating this strong emotional response. This also idea of true reality, I think, is really key. So, this idea that the reality that we experience every day is essentially covering up something deeper and more meaningful that lies beneath it. And also this idea of union with nature. So we won't see that so much in the story that we're looking at, but we do see this in a lot of Aikman's stories. So one of his longer stories, The Stains, is really about a union with nature and what happens when we try to remove ourselves from that. A lot of his stories involve passages set in nature. He has one story that I love called The Next Glade, which involves a very strange experience in a small woods near the protagonist's house. So these are some things that I want us to bear in mind when we're looking at his stories. This idea that through these moments where we have this intense emotional response, we glimpse the true reality that underlies the world that we experience every day. So he then says the novel exists to reaffirm the world of everyday reality. The short story exists to defamiliarize the everyday. Storytelling does not spring from one's encounter with the everyday world, but rather from one's encounter with the sacred, in which true reality is revealed in all its plenitude, or with the absurd, in which true reality is revealed in all its vacuity. So, I think this idea of defamiliarization is really central to Aikman's writing. He takes these very familiar everyday settings and experiences and makes them feel strange. So often the strange element in his strange stories is our everyday life. And I think we see both of these trends in his stories, but I think in the story we're looking at today, it definitely leans towards the absurd. And he reveals the kind of nonsense of the kind of surface of the everyday, but also the deep strangeness of what lies beyond it. It's a very disturbing story, I think. I find it very frightening, but it's also very funny in parts. And so I think we definitely see some use of absurdity here. So, some other ideas that I think are central to this. So, Randall Jarrell, also in this same collection, New Short Story Theories, refers to a dream told as if reality, or reality told as if it were a dream. I think this is central to the Artifice story and definitely to Aikman's story. So, either very strange things happen, but they're written in a very matter of fact way, and we'll talk a bit about the specific language choices he makes a bit later. Or people kind of move through normal situations, but they're told in this very dreamlike way. And we see a bit of both of those here. And so that again creates this sense of ghostliness, this kind of divorce from our normal experience of reality. Robert F. Marler, also in the same book, if it doesn't mention the book, that's where these quotes are from, in an essay called From Tale to Short Story, says that what these stories reveal is that the actual world is a facade, even a lie. The fictive world is an artifice that leads to truth. So this is kind of the essence of the Artifice story, I think. That obviously the story is artificial, it's fiction. Often there are things happening in these stories that couldn't possibly happen in our experience of the real world. But what they do is they reveal true things about the world we live in. So either the ways that it covers up deep experiences or how those experiences are felt. And again, I think this is really central to Aickman. Charles E. May says that stories often focus on a revelatory breakup of the rhythm of everyday reality. So I think we can see this in most ghost stories. Seeing a ghost represents a breakup of everyday reality. But we see this in Aickman's stories even when there isn't an explicitly supernatural figure present. And that is why I would argue that his stories are always ghostly, even when they don't feature explicit ghosts. And sometimes they do. There's a great story called The Train, that has a kind of ghost figure in it. But that it's almost a throwaway moment. And it's these moments where reality breaks down that are really revelatory. There is a fantastic moment in The Trains where it's about two women who are civil servants. They're hiking, they get lost. They end up in this house that used to belong to a station master. And there's a moment where one of the characters thinks that her friend has been assaulted by the man who lives in this house. Her friend then appears, she's very visibly shaken, but she doesn't appear to be physically harmed. But her pockets are full of train tickets. And even saying it now, that frightens me. It's such an odd detail. It's never explained. And I think that's a perfect example of this device. So I really recommend this book. It's called Monsters of the Market by David McNally. It's an academic book, but it's really readable. It's about how monster fiction can kind of defamiliarize capitalism and the political function of that. So he argues that the very insidiousness of the capitalist grotesque has to do with its invisibility, the ways in which monstrosity becomes normalized and naturalized via its colonization of the essential fabric of everyday life. Its elusive everydayness, its apparently seamless integration into the banal and mundane rhythms of quotidian existence. So he then argues that what monster fiction can do is disturb the naturalization of capitalism by insisting that something strange, indeed life-threatening, is at work in our world. So people may be familiar with Mark Fisher, whose great book Capitalist Realism argues that the problem with combating capitalism is that people can't imagine anything outside of it. And I've heard people say this when you complain about any aspect of capitalism, people say, well, that's how it's always been, which of course isn't the case. It's a constructed socioeconomic system. And so David McNally writes about how monster fiction can disrupt that sense of the natural. I think that strange fiction can do this also. So I wouldn't argue that Aickman's stories are kind of explicitly anti-capitalist or political in that sense, but they certainly explore the extent to which this everyday landscape, which is very much to do with economics, is in fact constructed and strange in its own construction. So some quotes now from Writing the Uncanny, which again I really recommend if anyone hasn't read it. It's essays by writers on how to write uncanny fiction. So Lucy McKnight Hardy in her essay argues that we should aim to leave the reader with a sense of loss, of an understanding not quite grasped, which I think is really central to this idea of the Artifice story, but I think is also what makes ghost stories generally really effective. If you explain everything away, then it's no longer so frightening. But if you leave readers with a sense of confusion, that can be really effective. Gary Budden writes of a necessity of a willingness to closely observe and reflect on the oddness we experience each day. So I think this is some advice for if you are a writer, not just while you're writing, but in everyday life. I always have a notes on my notes app where if I see any kind of strange interaction, I write it down when I observe it so that I can then mine it later. He also talks about the merging of the quotidian and the extraordinary. So you can see this comes up in a lot of people's theories of this kind of writing. And again, I think this is really central to Aickman's writing, but also to me, this is what makes a great ghost story. If a ghost story is set in a world where strange things happen all the time, it's not frightening. But if it's set in a very recognizable everyday world, that I think is when we find it disturbing. Jen Ashworth writes about this sickly realization that we too have been dead to the world all along and did not know it. That's again in the same collection. She's talking there about a Shelley Jackson story. But I think that's really the sense that we're left with Aickman. I recommend him to people often, and I always end up saying that I find his stories terrifying and I don't understand them at all. I never understand what exactly has happened or why it's so frightening. But I think this is the essence of what they leave us with. They make us realize how much our own everyday life is kind of deadened, and how much we are forced to kind of repress these experiences. What we might call these sacred experiences, not in any kind of religious sense necessarily, but these moments of wonder and deep affect. So, in this collection, there is a great essay on this specific story by Jeremy Dyson, and he writes about the story that at the end, on the one hand, almost nothing has happened. On the other, Mabry, that's the protagonist, Mabry's sure and certain place in the universe has been destroyed, shattered, it would seem, beyond repair. So we'll talk a bit about how that is achieved, but I think this is the essence of lots of Aikman stories. They're often quite long, but often there's very little actual plot. There are very few events that take place, and they don't have often moments of obvious horror. So it's very rare that protagonists are actually kind of physically harmed or threatened. Very little often takes place, but what they experience in the story completely shatters their sense of reality. So, some ideas about strangeness then. So, these are from Strangely Rhetorical, this great book by Jimmy Butts. So, he argues that whatever might be considered normal is the real hitch, and what we might see as strange are the real moments where we might just catch a glimpse of the really real relations going on. So, this is about these moments he's talking about rhetoric, so the way that we communicate, where something is strange, but we see through it relationality. There's a great essay that I read, where it's a conversation that was published in The Guardian years ago, and I studied it during my undergrad course, which was over 10 years ago now. It's a conversation between Colin McCann and Alexander Hemon, and they're talking about language, and one of them talks about he's Polish, and he talks about how sometimes he will use a strange turn of phrase, and his American wife will read it and say, "We don't say that," and he says that what he says is, "Now we do." And I think this is a great example of this process, where these moments of strange communication reveal these relations, not just between individual people, but to history, to society. And I think this is what we really see in Aikman's stories. So the strangeness is what reveals this kind of deeper reality. He quotes Haynes, who says that writing should be strange. We should feel alienated, removed, and detached from our standard habits of regarding and thinking. So, this is the idea that any kind of use of rhetoric, so to make any kind of argument, the whole point of making an argument is to make people reassess their standard ways of thinking, their previously held beliefs. And to do that, writing needs to be alienating. It needs to push us away from what we've previously believed. And I think fiction can do this too. And in that sense, it can also serve a kind of political function. And again, I wouldn't argue that Aikman is kind of an explicitly political writer, but certainly he was deeply discontented with modern life. And I think that he kind of shakes readers out of that by using very strange rhetorical techniques, which we'll dive into in a bit. And I think if you're interested in writing any kind of ghostly fiction, this is a really important thing to bear in mind. So it's not just about the actual events of the stories, but it's about how those events are conveyed. Often the things that are deeply strange in Aikman's stories are the language that's used. And I think it's probably for that reason that he's been very little adapted. There was an adaptation of The Hospice, which I wouldn't recommend, honestly. If you're curious, it might be worth seeing. But the Hospice is so ambiguous and the language is so central to it that I think a lot gets lost in conveying it to the screen. There's also a short adaptation of another story, The Cicerones, that was done by Jeremy Dyson and Mark Gatiss, which I actually think is very good. It's very short, but it takes a very different technique. There's actually very little dialogue in it, and it kind of conveys Aikman's strange language through these very strange images, which I think is a more effective way of doing it. And also they did a radio adaptation of Ringing the Changes, which is a fantastic story. So Butts argues that with rhetorical strangeness, we shift attentions. So this is this idea that by using the strange language, we move attention onto something that it might not ordinarily lie on. So it might be language itself, it might be human thought processes, and this is really central to Aickman, and we'll look at a few examples of this in a moment where he does this in the hospice. So, Burke talks about creating perspective by incongruity, established by violating the proprieties of the word in its previous linkages. So that again goes back to the conversation I mentioned before, the idea of a strange phrase that this American woman said, "We don't say that," and this Polish writer said, "Now we do." So I think this is a great example of this idea of violating the proprieties of the word. So challenging how we use language, making words seem out of place while still retaining some meaning. And I think what Aickman does with this technique specifically is actually uses very, very quotidian language. And in the process of that, reveals the strangeness of how we communicate. And again, we'll look at some specific examples shortly. So but writes that it is satisfying to allow these moments of small, strange effects to be momentary, but also to build on one another and gain momentum. Defamiliarization has chronological parameters. The epiphanic moment is what the strange can achieve, a brief encounter with something novel, however fleeting. Incongruity plays with breaking from expectation and delivers the payoff in a moment. Strange and novel work can wake people up, if only momentarily, and even if they go back to sleep. So I think this captures a lot of what we've discussed so far about this idea of the Artifice story. So it's these moments of breakthrough where you break through the kind of surface of the everyday world, kind of shake people awake. And I think Aickman really does this. By expressing his own discontent with modern life, he kind of translates that through this Gothic ghostly lens to make other people aware of actually how strange our everyday habits are. And I think this is really important, this idea that this is valuable, even if people then discard it. Because, often we don't have a choice but to live in these very modern ways. But I find myself sometimes when I'm in a work meeting thinking of turns of phrase that Aickman uses. So this kind of writing can be really effective and can really stick with readers. So the hospice. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to spoil an Aickman story because they're so ambiguous, and so as he said, strange. But to give a very brief synopsis, it is about a man called Maybury who he is kind of a traveling salesman. He is returning home from a job. He has been given a route to take. He becomes lost and runs out of petrol. And he ends up finding this strange building called the hospice. He can't quite work out what it is, whether it's an actual hospice, whether it's a hotel, whether it's some kind of asylum. But he goes in to ask to use their phone. He's informed that they don't have a phone, which he finds very strange. He then ends up staying for dinner, and some very strange things occur. So everyone is sitting in complete silence, eating mountains of food. He notices that one person has a chain around their leg and is chained to the table. But the waiters are extremely polite. They bring him this food, huge mountains of food, and he eventually says that he can't manage anymore. And this waitress becomes very upset and she smashes the food on the ground, which is a genuinely disturbing moment when you read it because it's such an odd reaction. He then has this strange kind of sexual interaction with another guest at the hotel. He's then shown up to his room where he is informed that he'll be having to share a room because there's no way for him to get home. He tries to siphon some petrol. The staff at the hospice advise that he could siphon some petrol from their car. They then remember at the last minute that it is run on diesel. There's a very strange moment where Maybury realizes that he can't remember how to start his car. He ends up staying the night. Very strange events occur. The person he's staying in a room with seems to change into a different person in the night. He hears this screaming. And in the morning, he is informed that someone died in the night who was staying in the hotel. And he ends up leaving in a hearse. And the final lines reference the fact that he will not have to wait for long. And it's, both referring to him getting home, getting a bus to get home, but also this sense of death. It's a very, very bizarre story. This doesn't capture the half of it. But what I want to zoom in on here is some specific kind of language uses, some specific passages that I think capture some of these ideas and are what create this very ghostly atmosphere. So even though there's no explicit ghost, it very much feels like a haunted house story. And these are some of the ways that Aickman achieves that. So firstly, this idea of leaving readers alienated, removed, and detached from our standard habits of regarding and thinking. So this is a passage, and this is from this version. I don't know if you can see this. So Faber and Faber recently republished 4 Aickman collections. There's Cold Hand in Mind, which is where this story is published. There's also Dark Entries, The Unsettled Dust, and The Wine Dark Sea. The Wine Dark Sea is the book that the title of this talk comes from. Here is a passage from The Night. So it says, Mowbray began to wonder whether something had gone wrong with his own time faculty, such as it was, something that is of medical significance. That whole evening and night, from soon after his commitment to the recommended route, he had been in doubt about his place in the universe, about what people called the state of his nerves. Here was evidence that he had good reason for anxiety. So this is what Jeremy Dyson mentions in his article, that he is left in doubt about his place in the universe, how the universe functions at all. The things that happen begin to detach him from what he sees as everyday reality. So again, this is from the night when he is in the hotel room. He lay there half in and half out for a long time. He concentrated on the thought that nothing had actually happened that was dangerous. Ever since his school days, and indeed during them, he had become increasingly aware that there were many things strange to him, most of which had proved in the end to be apparently quite harmless. So again, this idea that in these stories, often very little happens that actually threatens the narrator. And we might recognize this in other ghostly writers, such as M.R. James. Often the academic protagonists are relatively safe from harm. The harm that's done is psychological. It threatens what they think they know about how the universe functions and their own place in it. So then shifting attentions. So I think what we do here is we see how Aickman uses language to shift attention. So this is a reference to the waitress who becomes very upset when he declines more food. And Aickman writes, it was as if she were Mowbray's nanny, even though Mowbray had never had a nanny, not exactly. I find myself thinking about this not exactly a lot. It's never come back to, it's never explained. And I think it's something that Aickman does so brilliantly. He drops in these kind of hints as to something deeper, these hints as to a character's deeper life, but without ever delving into them. So it creates this sense of strangeness and mystery to the point that the kind of very human protagonists themselves become ghostly. There's this sense of mystery about them. And this is another great example of this. So this is when, so Faulkner is kind of the proprietor of the hotel. Mulligan is the name of the waitress. So Aickman writes, Faulkner returned round the bottom end of the long table. Mulligan, he asked, how many more times? His tone was as quiet as ever. Mowbray had not realised that the alarming woman was Irish. Now, I always find this so funny, but I think, again, it's such a great example of Aickman really delving into how we think and how often in very strange situations, the things that capture our attention are not what we thought they would be. And you hear this a lot. If you ever have heard people talk about their experiences where they think they have seen a ghost or when they have had near-death experiences, they often talk about zooming in on these very strange, mundane details. And I think what this achieves is it feels so real. It feels like a real human thought. And I think we see this again above in these moments that I think detach us from our standard habits of regarding and thinking. The reasons that I think these passages are so powerful is because even in the process of that alienation and detachment, the ways that they are written is so familiar to the ways that people think and the way that they process the world around them, that it becomes easy to attach ourselves to that thought process. So you can start to see here, if you haven't read any Aickman before, that he often uses this kind of very plain, conventional language. And in the process, he kind of draws attention to the strangeness of our own habits of cognition. So this idea of a glimpse of the really real relations going on. So this is a moment where he is having this strange erotic interaction with this other woman in the hotel. And Aickman writes, there was a passionate earnestness about her which might rob any such man as Mowbray of all assessment, but he was still essentially outside the situation. As a matter of fact, he had never in his life lost all control, and he was pretty sure by now that for better or for worse, he was incapable of it. So he puts these characters in these moments that we might associate with this idea of glimpses of the sacred, these moments of deep passion, these ideas that reality is being broken through. But actually, often Aikman's characters are resistant to these moments. They are still stuck in the behavioural patterns of the everyday. Um, and by kind of delving into Mowbray's psychology here, again, we have this glimpse of the really real relations going on. And again, I don't necessarily mean between the two people, so between Mowbray and the woman, but between people and social structures. So the way that Mowbray, as kind of a middle-aged, middle-class man, has been taught to behave in late 20th century Britain, and the impossibility of getting outside of that. So this is a moment where, after trying to siphon the petrol and it not working, Mowbray becomes very angry. And so this is Faulkner's response. Again, he's the proprietor of the hotel. "Mr. Mowbray," replied Faulkner, "I have to remind you of two things. The first is that I have invited you to be our guest in the fuller sense of the world." It should say "the" there, sorry. "The second is that, although you attach so much importance to efficiency, you nonetheless appear to have set out on a long journey at night with very little petrol in your tank. Possibly you should think yourself fortunate that you are not spending the night stranded on some motorway." So I think what Aikman reveals here is the sense of menace that can lurk behind politeness. So again, he's revealing this kind of depths of everyday language. So again, this is written very conventionally. It's kind of very polite business talk, but there's something very sinister about it. And I think it's all the more sinister because it is so politely delivered. I think this particularly works for British readers who know that menace can lurk beneath this kind of veneer of politeness, and often does. But this sense that the strangeness again lurks behind this very everyday use of the English language. So this next is from a very strange interaction that Mowbray has with Bannard, which is the man he's sharing his room with. This is after Bannard seems to have been replaced. And they have this very strange conversation about Mowbray's wife and his son, where Bannard is asking him very inappropriate sexual questions about his relationship with his wife, asks him about his son's appearance, the colour of his eyes and hair, to which Mowbray says no particular colour, which I also find very funny. But after this very absurd discussion, there is suddenly this shift in affect. So Bernard says, "I should love him were he mine, and my wife too." It seemed to Mowbray that Bernard said it with real sentiment. What's more, he looked at least twice as sad as when Mowbray had first seen him, twice as old and twice as sad. It was all ludicrous, and Mowbray at least felt very tired, despite the lump of Bernard looming over him and looking different. There's so much that we could pull out here, but I think this moment of affect breaking through immediately after this comic absurdity is really effective. So this is something that Aikman often does. You kind of veer quite wildly between very different modes of feeling. So you begin with this absurdity, you then get this deep emotion. And then there is something so frightening about him looking different. In that great essay by Jeremy Dyson, he talks about it being as if Bernard is a character who was played by two different actors. And so again, you get like all these different emotions, but again delivered through this very conventional language, because these stories are so much about the everyday. So finally, this idea of violating the proprieties of the word with its previous linkages. So this is when Mowbray is declining the pasta. So he says, "I've had enough. I'm sorry, it's very good, but I've had enough." To which the waitress says, "You said that before, sir, and look, here you are, still eating away." He knew that he had indeed used those exact words. Crises are met by cliches, which was almost the title I chose for this talk because I think it says so much about how Aikman writes. So often in these moments of deep crisis, people turn to the conventional for a sense of comfort. And I think this is such a great technique if you're trying to create a sense of the everyday that the ghostly then breaks through. I think we see it again in writers like M.R. James. Characters use these very conventional phrases in moments of deep distress. Another of my favourite lines of the story, this is about trying to get the car to start, and Aikman writes, "But violence proved effective, as so often." I think this is such a great sentence. Again, it's so conventional, possibly the most conventional of the story. As so often is one of Aikman's stock phrases. He uses this very often to draw attention to the kind of repetitiveness of everyday life. But I think contrasting that with violence is so, effective in its own right. Contrasting this mundanity with this burst of violence. And again, I think this is a great technique for creating this sense of the ghostly, contrasting these moments of horror with the everyday, which is what the ghostly is all about, really, in my opinion. And this, so there was recently a new issue of Cold Hand in Mine published that Jeremy Dyson wrote an introduction for, and he writes in it that this, to him, is the most frightening moment of the story. And I'm inclined to agree it's one of the most disturbing. So this is when Mabry is in his hotel room. He wants to open the window for some fresh air. He pulls back the curtains, and Aickman writes that behind the drawn back curtains was, as the children say, just wool. And so it's this moment where it's not just drawing on convention, but childishness. He kind of reverts to this childish language, childish way of seeing the world when he is confronted with something that he doesn't understand. And I think for me, what I love so much about Aickman is that when I was younger, everything is new and everything that you experience is so mystifying and so confusing. And there's something so exciting about that sense of the world as mysterious when you're still learning how the world functions. As adults, it's so rare, I think, that we experience that. And I think it's why many of us love the Gothic and love ghost stories, is because we're chasing that sense of mystery. I think we find that throughout Aickman's work, but he also captures it in characters themselves when they revert to this childlike sense of wonder and fear when they're unable to process the world. And I think that is so true to life. Again, this idea that this artifice constructs a real sense of reality. Often you hear about when people are in terrifying situations, they find themselves wanting their mum or wanting, this sense of childlike comfort. People reverting to this childlike sense of wonder and terror. So finally, this sense of the epiphanic moment. So this is the end of the story, which I referenced before. Mabry was compelled to travel with the coffin itself because there simply was not room for him on the front seat, where a director of the firm, a corpulent man, had to be accommodated by the driver. The nearness of death compelled a respectful silence among the company in the rear compartment, especially when a living stranger was in their midst, and Mabry alighted unobtrusively when a bus stop was reached. One of the undertaker's men said that he would not have to wait long. So people often argue that the entire kind of structure of a short story hinges on the ending. So this moment of epiphany, and this doesn't have to be necessarily a plot twist, just something that makes readers reassess the story that has come before, what it is all leading to. So there's very, very rarely kind of a twist ending in Aickman's writing. There's very often kind of an ending in the traditional sense at all. There's never kind of a sense of conclusion that anything has been resolved. The stories just kind of seem to fade back into our everyday life. But I think this is a great example of how you can still create this epiphanic moment. This strangeness of him being, the strange image of him in this coffin squeezed in next to it. This sense that death is looming over him, but it's totally mysterious as to in what sense that is true. Is it just that he has had this brush with death and now he'll carry it with him? Is there genuinely something menacing him? Or is it just kind of a comment on, again, this idea that he was already dead to the world, that in modern life, we are all kind of comparable to this corpse in the coffin? I don't think Aickman offers any solutions to that. But I think it's a great example of how when you're concluding a story, you don't have to explain everything. You don't have to explain anything for that matter. You can ask more questions. And I personally think that for ghostly stories, this is a particularly effective way to conclude a story, not with explaining everything, because in actuality, if you had a kind of ghostly experience, saw what you thought was a ghost, you wouldn't get any answers. My dad, who was one of the most skeptical people I know, had a ghost sighting and never got a resolution. And that is what chills him, that he never got an explanation for this strange event. And I think it's the same in fiction. We don't have to offer any answers. The epiphanic moment can be about how we relate to the world, having had this experience. And I think by kind of moving actually out of Mabry's perspective, because it's written in the third person, but it's the close third person, we stay very close to Mabry throughout the story. But by zooming out here, it kind of extrapolates this idea that Mabry was dead to the world, that his version of reality has been shattered, to kind of the wider world, including the world of the reader. So I think that brings us to time. I'll finish off there. Thank you so much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.